Well, let's talk a little bit about that with the panel then, because, and it wasn't that long ago when there was an argument about, boy, we're underfunded, but don't worry about it because all those obligations don't come due at the same time. Now, for instance, TRS is saying because of the underfunding and the fact the state's running a deficit, it could be insolvent in a number of years, in a couple of years, more than a couple. So let's then talk, if we can, about solutions and see if we can, because we want to talk about Cook County and about the city. And by the way, we invited the city to attend and be part of this panel, and they respectfully declined to join us. I'm not saying it had anything to do with the stories in the Tribune last week, but they respectfully declined. Let's talk a little bit of how we fix this situation then. Commissioner Gaynor, do you have some thoughts on that? And then Hank, we'll go to you.
Well, first, I think it's important to be clear where we are, how we got here from the county. So I thank Ralph for talking about those points, and we had done the research to figure that out as well. But the issue is this: the county has never missed a pension payment, and the cost of benefits for the county is 21.5% of payroll. So they determined that the cost was 21.5% of payroll, and they paid that amount every year, never missed a payment, and went forward. In the last, so 10 years ago, they were 90% funded, the county pension fund. In the last 10 years, there was an early retirement program in '03 that cost the county, or will cost the county $1 billion by the time it's all said and done. That was for 2,000, just over 2,000 employees. There was massive pension, massive investment losses, $1.5 billion just in 2008 alone, and then the cost of retiree health care. As far as going forward, I think the key thing you have to start out with is to echo what both Lawrence and Hank said, which is what's the purpose of a pension? A pension is to provide a sustainable retirement for people after they've left public service. So the first thing to do is define what is that sustainable pension and what does that look like? There's two things to consider as well. The retirement ages in public sector are lower. It could be argued that there are certain jobs, especially law enforcement, and you could also probably have a county hospital to that are intense and highly stressful, and you really is it reasonable to assume people work there longer into their 60s? But the retirement ages are lower, the life expectancies have grown, and then you have to determine how do you give someone something that's sustainable for a population that doesn't participate in Social Security. So if you spent the majority of your career at the city or the county, or all of the funds, I think, at the state, or maybe there's one or two exceptions, you have not participated in Social Security. So this is the entire retirement income that you are relying on. So I think that we want to determine what is it that someone needs to retire and make that be fair. Once you start with that equation, and Hank is right and Ralph is right. The way we calculate the equation by multiplying the salary base by 1.54, the employee contribution, it doesn't make any sense actuarially. It's a number that came up because that was the normal cost of the pension, and so they contributed it, but it wasn't able to sustain shocks like early retirement or investment losses. And now we're in a position where we have to change the system going forward. I'm sorry, go ahead. No, really quickly then. When we started to look, so the county's had a pension fund only for about a year and a half. I'm its first chair, and our determination, the pension committee, when we came in was to figure out what was the funded status of the fund, how bad a shape were we in, if we were in bad shape at all, and what were the changes we could do going forward. The document that we produced and the website that's out there there's only a limited number of levers to move. You can raise retirement age, you can lower the multiple, you can increase the contribution, there's a handful of things. You can lower the COLA, change the COLA, and we put a number next to each of those things. What would it mean if you changed this a little bit, that a little bit? What would it mean? How would you get to solvency? And so it was a basis to start a conversation. I won't go into the details of what we did in each one of those things. But we've probably spoken to, 25 or 30 groups around the county, mostly of employees, and we've gotten a lot of great suggestions of things we could do differently. So I think there's a huge range of solutions going forward, but I also think we should be willing to consider that it may look different going forward. That doesn't mean it's bad.
Hank, how does labor view these range of solutions that are being offered?
Mostly unconstitutional. But let me comment on a couple things. I agree with much of what Bridget said. I think the county is far from the poster child for irresponsibility, which you mentioned, the early retirement and transfer of retiree health. City of Chicago did 3 unfunded early retirements, and furthermore, actually reduced their multiplier in the municipal fund, which is and the one that our members belong to, from 1.69 to 1.25 some years ago. That was to free up property tax revenue to fund infrastructure. That was a Mayor Daley idea. And, the unions, we went along with it. All the actuaries blessed it. They said 1.25 was enough. Again, as Ralph said, and as I think we all agree, having a multiplier as a strict multiple of what the employees are putting in is not an actuarial, governmental accounting board blessed standard for properly funding a pension. And IMRF took the same hit as everybody else, and they're recovering because their statute allows them, in effect, to catch up. So, that's the issue. Bridget and I, we spent 24 months on this very august commission. I see Tom Ryan from the firefighters who's on the commission, other people in this room, with the business community trying to forge a consensus. After 24 months, the business community refused to go on the document. They dissented. But, the thinking of the business community has evolved in kind of strange ways. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, they would all tell you, Eden Martin and Lester Crown and the other represented business, we don't want to touch anything that people have already earned, right? We don't want to touch retirees. We understand that we can't impair the benefits that public employees have already earned. All we want to do is to lower their accrual, going forward. And there's frankly a legal debate over whether you can even do that, right? But now we have proposals from Commissioner Gaynor and frankly from Governor Quinn, and what's implied but not stated so directly by Mayor Emanuel, that absolutely, positively reach into the pockets of current retirees and current employees and reduce the unfunded liabilities, not by paying it off, but by diminishing the benefits that they have already earned. Some people might call that theft. You could call it theft. And we believe that that is unconstitutional. Now, that said, we are meeting with Bridget Gaynor. We have met with her. We'll continue to meet with her. If the mayor wants to meet with us, we will. The public employee unions are engaged very actively in Springfield right now around the state-funded systems, trying to come up with a solution. And we've told, despite our constitutional concerns, we want to solve this problem and figure out a responsible way to do it. But the retirees and the workers don't have, the state retirees and the teachers and the universities, they don't have $83 billion.
So long as
and our city members don't have whatever it is, 15 or 17 billion, whatever the 4 city funds, and our county members don't have $6 billion to bail out the county. We don't. As Ralph pointed out, it is a hard message to put out in the public and for the taxpayers to hear. The taxpayers over the last 40 years, they got their policing, their firefighting, their teaching, their human services, their healthcare, their public safety on the cheap. They didn't pay for it. They didn't pay for the full cost. And the problem with shared sacrifice, I'm all for shared sacrifice, I don't hear very much in reality about shared sacrifice. The governor's position will solve the problem on the backs, let me finish, of the retirees and the actives, as will Commissioner Gaynor's largely. There's a very tiny increase in employer contribution in her framework, and we know from public statements of Ron Emanuel, what he's trying to do is duck the impending increase that's already in the law for the police and fire pension funds because it's unaffordable.
Okay.
So, we're talking about welshing on commitments, and, we're already lawyered up. If we have to go to court, we'll go to court. We're not happy about going to court. It's not going to solve the problem. If something is declared unconstitutional in a few years, we'll be back at square one.
All right, now,
so it's a darn shame, but that's maybe where we're headed.
Hank, so Hank's talking going to court. thievery, welshing.
I don't want to go to court, but we will.
Court is the last resort. Commissioner Gainey, you want to respond to Mr. Saul? I'd like you to respond to.
I don't want to respond, I just want to make the clarification, which is, we put out a series of valuations of the very limited things that you could do in a fund, and including increasing contributions or all of these things. If you don't put out there something for people to talk about, then we all sit around in the dark. So we are very open to comments, but this is the thing to remember. Nothing in the plan that we have put forward retracts back from what people have already earned. It slows the rate of accrual going forward, and that includes the COLA. So we can debate that. I just want you to be clear that nothing goes back to what has already been earned.
Wait, hang on a second.
She just said the COLA's not diminished.
No, I didn't say the COLA is not diminished. I said it's nothing that people have already earned.
People have already earned the right to a 3% compounded COLA based on the years of service and the benefits they've accrued up to now. Commissioner Gaines' proposal does not apply 3% compounded COLA up to the benefits accrued as of the effective date of the lower one going forward. It's to go back and do half of the lesser of 3% or one half of CPI, non-compounded to all of the accrual. That is a retroactive diminishment of already earned pension benefits.
Okay, thanks for that. Lawrence, would you like to respond or comment?
Just a couple of things. One, it's not a COLA if it's not tied to the cost of living. And it's not indexed to anything. It's an automatic 3% increase, compounded. And it is probably the largest driver of the unfunded liability. That's why there's so much attention to that 3%. It's compounded, and it ends up by, in the case of the state's $85 billion in unfunded pension liability, it represents about a third of it. The reason why people are looking at the benefits going forward, or looking at the benefits now in terms of changing that, is the way you solve it, and as I think you've said before in meetings, Hank, the way you solve an $85 billion problem is with $85 billion. And unfortunately, the sacrifice that the taxpayers made when we increased the income tax from 3 to 5% didn't solve the state's pension problem. The state took basically all of that money. Right now, we're contributing about $6.5 billion. About 20% of every general revenue fund dollar goes into the pensions, and that's going to continue to grow if nothing is done, so that it taps out at about 27% of all general fund dollars will be going in there. In the case of the city of Chicago, that august commission that you were a technical advisor to, and I served on, identified that the cost to the city of Chicago to fund the actuarial required contribution would be $800 million in new funding that the city would have to identify. In 2015, the police and fire pension fund, as you're saying, the Mayor Emanuel is concerned about how he's going to reach, requires $550 million in new funding for the city of Chicago just to get on the 30-year funding plan to 90% for police and fire. That stabilizes those funds if we can find that approximate $550 million. Just so people are aware, right now the city of Chicago's entire property tax levy that goes to pensions is about $425 million. So those of you not receiving a pension from the city of Chicago just will want to be aware of the sacrifice that Hank doesn't think you're going to make when we double your property taxes in order to make that contribution.
And Ralph, I know you want to get in here, please.
So, a couple of things on that. As I am a property taxpayer here in Cook County, do you know what your property tax levy was for Cook County government this year? You know what it's going to be? $720 million. Do you know what it was in 1994?
I do.
$720 million. Hasn't changed. Do you know what inflation has been over that period? Consumer price index? 54%. So do you know what that $720 million is worth in real terms today? I did the math. It's worth $326 million. If you don't have revenue that at least grows with the modern economy, then no solution is sustainable. Because at some juncture, your investment returns will be poor, your statutory funding formula has no flexibility, and suddenly you have an unfunded liability again. You're going to take more benefits away from workers, or you're going to finally start paying for public services. Now, at some juncture, everything does have to be on the table, and I get that this is a political process, and that the problem has grown so large that some people who didn't cause the problem are going to end up having to pay for part of it, and that will fall on the back of workers. That'll be part of the political compromise. But it also has to include real and sustainable tax reform that can work in a modern economy. And we don't have tax policy that'll work at the state or the local level in Illinois, and that is what has driven these unfunded liabilities. That is why we have borrowed against these systems. And so now, to that state contribution that Lawrence pointed out is growing so much. This year it's scheduled to be $5.1 billion. That's significantly more than last year's $4 billion contribution. Do you know how much of that growth in contribution is due to the normal cost we owe for current workers' benefits? Zero. Nothing. This is all repayment of debt. In fact, this year's normal cost for benefits is about $100 million less than last year's. It's a negative impact on what the state's putting in. See, when we borrowed this money to fund current services, we passed a repayment schedule back in 1995 that's unattainable and unrealistic, that is significantly backloaded, and in fact, doesn't work. And so, do you structure your mortgage so that every year your debt repayment level jumps by 23, 24% from the prior year? Is that how you structure a mortgage? Because that's how we structure repayment of this debt. It is idiotic. And that has to go on the table. And we have to re-amortize this debt into a realistic amortization schedule.
It's the first time I've been at a panel where someone clapped for amortization.
But that's why you got.
I want to let you finish. Finish up your point.
I'll finish up the point. So, here in Illinois, none of our tax policy matches any of the principles of sound tax policy. And Hank has mentioned the term structural deficit. I'm just going to define it simply. It means that if you just adjust for inflation and population growth and you assume a normal economy, nothing bad, your revenue growth from your tax policy won't keep up with the cost of maintaining your services from year to year.
Okay.
There will be a gap. And we have papered over that gap with borrowing against the pensions. Now we've got to pay it back, and to make any reform, even the ones you suggest sustainable, we've got a fixed revenue policy so that we can meet our obligations going forward, or we'll just create this crisis again in another 10 years.
So I want to ask you, just if you don't mind, a couple of questions before we go to questions from the audience, but we've already hit on a couple of the so-called hot button issues that came out of the governor's pension task force group. And I don't want to do this like it's speed dating, but I would like to get your responses. Raising the retirement age, let's just go from Hank down. Do you agree with raising the retirement age as it's being proposed? And if not, why not?
It's not a simple question, unfortunately. I might personally easily recognize what Bridget Gaynor is saying, that people are living longer and so on. There are real constitutional questions as to whether you can do that. I mean, how do you raise somebody's retirement age only prospectively? They can't retire twice. They have the right now to retire at some age. So I think it's problematical. I do need to make a point about shared sacrifice, though, which I was trying to do earlier. The problem right now is the politicians, particularly in Springfield, are not interested in shared sacrifice. And it's clearly in the economic projections that have been shared with the unions. The operating assumption of the governor's pension reform proposal is that the sunset provisions of the income tax, the temporary increase that they enacted a year and a half ago, will in fact kick in January 1st, 2015. So the taxpayers will get a tax cut January 1st, 2015, financed not by the haircut that the governor claimed he wanted to give everybody, but by the scalping that public employees and public retirees were taking. We're not only supposed to give up already accrued benefits, about half of the unfunded liability. Our members are not only expected to pay 3% more out of their checks, they're supposed to pay enough so that the income tax increase that everybody knew, except maybe a few goofy Republicans, was not going to be temporary. They are operating under the assumption that it's going to get rolled back. I do not call that shared sacrifice.
Okay, Hank, let's go back to the, if we may, Commissioner Dane.
On retirement age, so some of the retirement ages that have been circulated in Tier 2 as well as in the governor's plan are to raise a uniform mandatory retirement age to 67. In our plan, we did not do that. I think certain jobs, as I mentioned before, don't lend themselves to someone working to that age. And so we raised it 5 years, which means that right now you can retire between 50 and 65 with 85%, depending on how much time you have. So we raised it 5 years. I think you can raise it. I think you have to be mindful of certain jobs in the public sector that don't lend themselves to someone in their late 60s.
Lawrence?
So raising the retirement age to 67 is pretty much aimed at matching up with Social Security in terms of what when you qualify for and Medicare for the full benefits. Nobody wants to see the state having to change its promises. But we need to be realistic, and I want to move, even though we need to move off the state, because this panel is supposed to be about the city and the county. The city and the county aren't on a ramp. They're not on a borrowing plan. They're just on a fictitious funding plan that's not tied to what the actuaries say. And so if you want real reform, you tie the pension to what the actuaries say is the cost of the program, and you adjust it every year. The IMRF is not succeeding with their pension plan only because that they have the hammer over the local governments. It's because every year they readjust to incorporate the changes. We've gotten away from that in Illinois. That allows, the other thing that I think is important to know, we make tons of changes, as both Ralph and Bridget mentioned, really relating to early retirement at the state and the county level, and nobody is ever held accountable for whether the actuary said that was going to fulfill the promise, that we were going to change the funding level for that. Now here we are. The city of Chicago has hundreds of millions in structural deficit, hundreds of millions in pension obligations, billions actually in the case of the city, $14 billion or so in unfunded pension liabilities. Where are we going to get that money? You can say that we held the property tax levy for the county, and if all of you had to do was pay your county property tax levy, you'd have a lot more money. But most of you are sophisticated enough to know that there's something like the Chicago Public Schools on your property tax bill, which also has a horribly underfunded pension system that is, once it gets off the state's partial pension holiday schedule, is going to be faced with enormous challenges. You also have all of the city government, the water reclamation district, the city colleges. So those levies did not stay flat over the same time the county did. The county and the city may maintain a flat levy over time. They raised other taxes and fees. Some of you recall the sales tax increase. Others might recall different property taxes increase at the city, or the sales tax, or the bottled water taxes, and all the very few lack of sacrifice taxes that the citizens of Chicago pay. So the fact that we have to change the benefits at 67 is significant because it's tied to what the health insurance costs are, the retiree health insurance costs. You need to bring that up so that you can reduce the amount of money coming out of those pension funds or coming out of the state coffers for that.
Okay. Ralph, I know you're itching probably to respond to that, but tell me about the retirement age first. What do you think?
Well, I take the nuanced view that not every job is the same, and so certainly going to 67 years old for somebody who's working in the recorder's office and filing documents makes sense to me. I don't think correctional facility officers or fire police in general, or frankly, if you knew my kids, a 67-year-old kindergarten teacher get eaten alive. So I mean, there are a number of different professions where it just doesn't work. But taking that nuanced view would be good policy. What I think would be the best thing to happen is any concessions the workers decide to make on the benefit side, and I do think that the constitutional protections are tough, and that you can't take benefits away from current or retired workers. That's how I read it. That's how the Arizona Supreme Court interpreted their constitution just recently, which has a very similar clause to Illinois. I do think that that's a constitutional protection that's inviolate, but To the extent that there are going to be concessions made on this going forward, and you could do that to modify a contract as long as there's give and take, everything needs to be on the table, including the sustainability of the funding piece. So add the revenue reform to it. Put in the requirement that there can be no more pension holidays, that in fact there is an IMRF style system passed. So we don't get into these problems in the future. And you have the makings of a good reform.
Last pension forum we had, everybody was talking about Rhode Island. Here it's the IMRF that was pointed to as the...
Why import? It's
a lot closer
when we've got it right here that is.
I think also, this panel is focused on the city and the county, the other panel is focused on the state. No one's figured out a way to create an IMRF model to make the state make its contributions annually matched up to what the actuaries say.